Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell, and I'm going to be talking about a couple things here. So there's going to be a video that's going to be coming out that I did Spaces last night on. So it's just a republication of that on my other channels. So please subscribe to my YouTube channels. I have 3 of them. You can just click the link in the description of each of my videos and it'll take you to the different channels. Subscribe. So I have 3 YouTube channels. I have a Brighteon channel, a Rumble channel, and a Bitchute channel. So please, to get all the updates, go there. So first order of business here to discuss. Hopefully the wind isn't too bad here during the recording. So I want to talk about thyroid. Thyroid, for the ones that don't know, is in your neck, and it's an important organ, a gland. It's not an organ, a gland. But and this secretes thyroid hormone from a signal that's coming from your brain, from the pituitary, and that signal will tell the thyroid, oh, you know, we need more T4, right? And T4 is the thyroid hormone. Now, there's a lot that goes on in terms of conjugating iodine, you know, to a certain molecule that creates this thyroid hormone. And then T4 will break down into T3. Okay? So we have these binding proteins in our serum that will bind free T4, right? And so these T4 binding proteins are somewhat of a regulatory function, all right? Being able to control. So just step back a little bit. So you have a thyroid secreting hormone, TSH, right? That's signaling to the thyroid to create T4, and then T4 breaks down to T3. Okay, that's the basics. Okay? It gets a little bit more complicated, but that's the basics. But when your thyroid hormones are too high, and you have a functioning thyroid, that's a negative feedback that will downregulate TSH and downregulate additional thyroid hormone production. Okay, but when you have this binding protein for T4, you have binded T4 and free T4 floating around in your bloodstream, and that free T4 will break down to T3, right? And that will send signals to different cells to do certain things, right? And that there's a feedback, all right? The body is thinking, okay, I have a certain concentration of T4, free T4, non-bonded. So when we do the lab work on blood, we're looking at free T4, free T3, right? And then total, right? And when you subtract the total, let's say you subtract the total T4 to free T4, and that'll tell you roughly how much is bound to this protein, binding protein for T4. Okay, so some people have a mutation on their binding protein, and that binding protein for T4 mutation doesn't work as well, right? And it's not binding correctly. So you'll have more T4, in free T4 in the bloodstream, and then that will lead to a feedback loop to bring down TSH, right? And bring down total T4, right? Because the body is thinking that it has too much free T4. So, you know, I just kind of wanted to bring up, even though it sounds a little complicated while I'm walking, and it's probably better to do it on a whiteboard, but the point here is that you can seem to have a normally functioning thyroid, right, based on looking at lab values for TSH and looking at lab values for, let's say, free T4, right? Or, you know, yeah, free T4. And you could have a binding protein that is mutated and not working correctly. So it's just it's an interesting example where a system within the cells, within cells or within glands or within, you know, our biology, that you can have something not working correctly, but there are other feedback loops that get back into homeostasis, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing where your binding protein isn't working, there's too much free T4, that sends a feedback loop to the pituitary, reduces the TSH secretion, tells the thyroid to stop creating T4, and then it you know, goes back to homeostasis, where you're, yeah. Get a call there, sorry. So kind of function. I'll probably go over that a little bit more in another video on YouTube. Now, there is I wanted to go up and discuss a little bit about the naive T cells, okay? We have different types of T cells and T helper cells. And one is a naive, right? And it gets signals from an APC. It senses something, right? And it can differentiate into different types of T helper cells. And this gets into the CCR, you know, receptors and naive 7 and all this, right? It gets kind of complicated, but I'm going to try to just boil it down to the simplicity here. So there are T helper cell 1, T helper cell 2, T helper cell 17, and there's a few others, but Treg. All right. So the APC will signal the naive or TH0 or T, right? The naive T cell to differentiate, and it will secrete certain types of chemicals, cytokines, to start to differentiate. All right. So, and there are 2 main paths, either an inflammatory path or an anti-inflammatory path. So typically, what will happen is, let's say you're going into a inflammatory pathway, right? Or anti-inflammatory pathway. Let's start with that. So your naive T cell gets a signal from APC or the surrounding environment, and it will start to differentiate, and that differentiating signal is IL-4 for the anti-inflammatory pathway. So that will turn a cell into a T helper cell 2, all right? And that is important because that's starting to produce the anti-inflammatory cytokines, IL-4 and IL-10, all right? Now, for the signal to turn into a T1, it's IL-12. And that T1 will then eventually start to secrete pro-inflammatory cytokines like interferon gamma, TNF alpha, and IL-2. Now, what will happen for T helper cell 17 is that it gets a signal to differentiate via IL-1, IL-6, and IL-23. And then that one's an easy one to remember. T helper cell 17 secretes IL-17. Now, why are these important? Well, based on the signal from the APC depends on what kind of T helper cell you need, right? So T helper cell 1 is going to be typically for your intracellular problems like, viruses, right? Right? But you can have intracellular bacteria too. Now, T helper cell 2, even though it is anti-inflammatory in some cases, it has an extracellular kind of capability, right? And then IL-17 will also have that. So T helper cell 1, intracellular, bacterial, viral, right? Pathogens. Your TH2 will help with fighting, infections, and also help with it's part of the allergy pathway, right? And then the extracellular pathogens like bacteria, right, will be knocked out or be attacked by the TH17. And then there is this process whereby the immune system will go, okay, I have too much T helper cell 1 or 2 or 17, and it'll start to upregulate Treg, all right? So Treg starts to secrete if it's signaling, if it's getting a signal that there's too much going on in the immune system in that area or whatever, it'll start to upregulate Treg, and it'll start to secrete a cytokine, or cytokines, IL-10 and TGF beta. And these are typically under the category of anti-inflammatory, right? So Treg will start to bring down those Th1s, Th2s, T17s. But there's a lot of signaling that's going back and forth, right? And you know that there's a complexity there that only a chart, showing a chart would truly explain it better than just doing some sort of walk. So why is this important? Well, let's go back to what I was saying about AIDS-like syndrome, okay? When you have a problem, you know, what is AIDS-like syndrome? AIDS-like syndrome is, you know, if we just look at break down the words, right? A syndrome, something that we don't really understand, that's similar to AIDS, okay? It's not AIDS, but it's similar, okay? And what is basically AIDS? Well, it's a syndrome that's highly related to HIV, okay? But you can have something happen to your body, right? I'm being generic here for obvious reasons, but you can have things happen to your body that affect the immune system. And when you're affecting the CD4, CD8 cells, especially in the naive state, then you're going to have problems with production of T helper cell 1, 2, and 17, right? Right? And you can also have a problem with upregulating Treg. Okay, so there's two things that can happen with AIDS-like syndrome. There's the too much Treg, which suppresses the immune system, right? To a point where opportunistic infections happen. There isn't a proper response against cancer. There's a reactivation of, let's say, tuberculosis. There are fungal infections that normally the immune system will fight, right? So remember, you know, like fungal infections, they're typically extracellular, right? So your extracellular T helper cells, when they're differentiated in AIDS-like syndrome, aren't working as well, right? There's a dysfunction, and you know, it causes a problem with clearing. So I think it's important to kind of understand that there's this interplay that's going on in AIDS-like syndrome that is dealing with, in some cases, too much Treg, and in other cases, and that, you know, and obviously too much Treg will affect the survival of the differentiated T helper cells 1, 2, and 17. But even if you don't have a super high upregulation of Treg, you can have problems with the signaling pathway that after differentiation of T, let's say T1, it's just not functioning right to be able to fight the infection. But more likely, in the context of our contemporary situation, again, I'm being generic to try to keep this video up, you will see hold on, just make sure that I'm you will see that it's the naive cell. It's the TH0, right? Or TH0, as some people call it. But the naive cell, early on in the differentiation pathway, right? Especially if you have certain things that are affecting the stem cell line for the naive T cell. Now, I think I said enough for people to understand what I'm talking about. But I think that this is important, and I'll probably go into a little bit more detail. But in parting here, thyroid, a lot of things can happen with the thyroid. And this conversation with the thyroid isn't so much related to this naive T cell that I was talking about. I mean, it can be in certain cases, but that was kind of a separate subject, separate conversation for this recording. The body, with the thyroid, it's producing thyroid hormone based on signaling, right? Well, I mean, you can have an activate, grapes, for example, can activate the thyroid independent of the pituitary signaling pathway. But let's just say that you don't have Graves'. Let's just say that you have a relatively normal functioning pituitary gland and thyroid gland. Well, that's going to produce this T4, and then T4 will mostly turn into T3. I believe a little bit T3 is secreted out of the thyroid too, but most of T3 is through a conversion process from T4 to T3. But then there is this binding protein. So that regulates how much concentration of free T4 is in the serum, right? In your blood, right? And then because of the negative feedback loop of T4 to the pituitary, it'll determine how much to secrete for TSH and downregulate the secretion of thyroid hormone, right? And the main point here is that you can go into homeostasis for thyroid hormone production, even if you have a mutation on the binding protein that's holding T4, because there's kind of a self-regulatory system. And the whole point is that there are times when we have pathways that are dysfunctional or mutated in such a way, but there is a correcting mechanism sometimes, not always, but sometimes. So you can have a dysfunctioning thyroid binding protein, but you still have a functioning thyroid. You still have a functioning secretion of T4, right? And the production of T3. But there's cases where the actual receptors aren't working right, and that causes a whole other pathology where you may have enough T3, but it's not working. It's not activating those receptors. So there's a downstream pathology of as if you had hypothyroidism, even though you have high levels of at that moment in time, you have high levels of T3. But then what happens is that there's kind of a feedback loop, and then it starts to produce less. So it's complicated, but I just that was the main point of this whole binding protein concept. This is that you can have something that goes wrong, and there are other systems in place that kind of try to do self-correction. But it doesn't always, not everything is like that. And then obviously the importance of the differentiation of naive T helper cells into T1, T2, T17. And then this kind of, if you have a working immune system, this self-regulating process through Treg, which is, this whole thing is very complicated. What I brought up with the simple signaling pathways through cytokines is just the surface level of understanding. There's a very complex, orchestrated signaling set of feedback loops that are happening here. But in the context of AIDS-like syndrome, if you don't have proper Treg, right? You know, proper regulation of Treg, you know, it's overproduced. It's gonna bring down your other T helper cells. And then if you have dysfunctioning, naive CD4 and CD8, right, then it may not differentiate properly and produce the cytokines that it needs to fight certain types of infections. Like I said, Th1, intercellular, Th2, you know, extracellular, T17, extracellular, right? So hopefully that kind of gives you a little better understanding. So please subscribe to my channels. I have 3 channels on YouTube. I have Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. Those channels are either just called Paul Cottrell or Dr. Paul Cottrell. And please subscribe. I'm heavily censored, so it's very hard to be able to see my work, but I have a lot of it backed up on Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble, right? As I've been covering this crisis for the last over 3 years. So thank you for participating, listening. I appreciate it. Hopefully you can share my content to help get subscribers to you know, see this kind of, I think, important understanding of what's going on with the immune system, and you know, to help support my news coverage. In addition, you can go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. All my videos have links to everything, all my channels and to my website. So just click the link of any video that I've done, and it'll take you to the store. It's the-studio-reykjavik.com, and take a look at the health supplements that I offer. I offer nanosilvers. I offer a plethora of supplements through Boomer products, and C60 is a very a very good product for antioxidants, right? So the whole idea with the supplement store is it's kind of an anti-aging concept that I've been pushing for a long time. I've been doing supplementation since I was 16 years old, primarily because of the heart disease that runs in my family. And so I've been very vigilant in terms of, you know, supplementation and diet, exercise, and all this, right? So you know, there's 3 pillars to this anti-aging. There's the nanosilver, the structural nanosilver, to neutralize pathogens. Because if you neutralize the pathogen, then you don't have to activate your naive T cells too often and get this, you know, too much pro-inflammatory response. Because pro-inflammatory response will actually age you quicker. So if you can neutralize the pathogen before activating the T1s and the T2s, then you're better off, right? Because you don't have all that, you don't have, you know, that inflammatory response that's aging the tissue. So neutralizing pathogens through the structural nanosilver, that's liquids and gels, soaps and lozenges. And then, you know, I have multivitamins, I have a plethora of supplements, from vitamin C all the way to clarity factor and good night formula and B complex, and, you know, anti-inflammatory type supplements like turmeric and ashwagandha. So that other pillar is bring down the inflammation. And then the other pillar of this anti-aging protocol is a very strong antioxidant like C60. When you take that, then you're reducing the cellular stress right? Because you're neutralizing that charged oxygen, and then you're bringing down that whole inflammation with the turmeric and the ashwagandha, because the ashwagandha is controlling blood glucose levels, and high glucose levels is correlated to, you know, inflammation at the vascular level, and, you know, neutralizing the pathogens with the structural nanosolar. So, and then you add stuff to that, you know, resveratrol, vitamin C, collagen, multivitamin, you know, whatever you need. But you know, you start, and by doing this on a regular basis, you'll start to see that you're improving your health, and your cellular tissue is actually healing and getting to the point where, as it's recycling some of the senescent cells, especially with the resveratrol, it's recycling the senescent cells, and what will happen is that it will start to proliferate younger cells from your adult stem cells, and that tissue, you know, over, let's say, a 6-month period, before you start the protocol versus, let's say, 6 months into the protocol, you'll start to notice at the cellular level that the age of the cells are younger because it's gotten rid of the senescent cells. The senescent cells are because of the lower telomeres length, right? And they go into kind of like a hibernation mode, but those senescent cells are not good because they're not really functioning like they should, or they can, you know, turn into a dysfunctioning cell. And age is an accumulation of a lot of things, accumulation of toxins and accumulation of senescent cells and a weakening immune system. But when you supercharge your immune system by this protocol, then you're gonna start seeing, in a short amount of time, you know, you just feeling better. You're having more energy, and when you have more energy, you'll move around more, and you'll have more muscle mass, and when you're doing that, your glands will start to produce better. Another great supplement that I have, and especially when we start to get older, is the digestive enzyme supplement. This helps with digesting the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids that we eat, right? But as we get older, our pancreatic, our pancreas doesn't secrete these enzymes as well. And because of that, we need a little bit of help. So, you know, supplementation with the digestive enzymes is, you know, can help with that process and reduce the load on the pancreas. So hopefully you learned something. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and use the discount, all caps, discount 5, and that will give you a $5 discount for the ones that are listening. So thank you for listening to this Spaces and helping support my work. Have a nice day.